I'm Carlos from 6A Architects. This is Will from Price & Myers. The project is in West London. It's in North Kensington, and the area in grey was demolished in the mid-60s for the construction of this ring road, which got cancelled in 1973. So the area around the side was all barren land and used for very impromptu building works of contractor workshops and very ad hoc building. So it sort of defines the type of site that we found. This was the view out of the original building when we first went there, down the road. Quite mixed use. This is what the client bought, an old wood workshop built in the 50s, full of asbestos. To the left, the housing association project from the 70s. This is what we promised him, and this is what he got. So this is Juergen taking a picture of a Japanese rock band outside the building just after he got the keys. This is the client on a donkey. The project fundamentally changed the way Juergen works. He used to always shoot on location, and since getting the building, he's completely swapped to just shooting in the building for most of his work. So he uses the building as location. In a way, that was a change of brief that the building quite happily managed, so it was quite good. The site is a 60-meter long plot that entered from one end. In front of the plot, there's a series of warehouses, which I showed the picture. Behind this warehouse is a train line. To the right, just underneath, sorry, the new 2008 building. Up here, a kind of cul-de-sac typical of 1970s planning. Substation on the party wall, conservation area to the back. And the furthest you get from the street, the more private the building gets. If someone has been to the library at Juergen's studio, it's because they know him quite well. So it's a series of building, courtyard, and another building with a tiny courtyard. All of the buildings sort of share a DNA, share a tectonic, but then they adjust to the site quite dramatically to different conditions. This is another section explaining that situation: train line, industrial warehouses. This is the building, stepping down towards the Victorian houses, conservation area. This axo shows a little bit more about the program. So building 1 is a 3-story building. It houses the kind of more working parts of the building: an archive, office, meeting rooms, storage. Then the second building is his main studio, which he originally designed for layouts on tables, but also very flexible to be used as in many other ways. Third building is the most private of all of them. It's got a communal kitchen, a library, a little gym, a sauna. So very early on, we also did these models, which became really important in the process, about utilizing the depth of the plot and having this ability to see from the front of the plot right to the back of the plot, seeing through a room, through courtyard, through another room, like sequentially. Here you can see in the plans, this is the ground floor plan. So from the front door, you can see all the way through to the backyard. Even if you're never going to make it there, you have an idea of how big the building is. The front facade includes very few elements. It's kind of quite quiet and kind of quite restrained to the street. A massive double height window, which we'll talk about in the next few slides, and a blank front door, which is wide enough to be able to take cards and all of the shooting equipment that he needs to take. You could drive a car through that door. And then things like M&E ventilation is done in a very, very direct way. This is the first yard. Bear in mind that these pictures are taken just as the building's completed, so these yards look a little bit barren now, but they've grown over time and they're really lush. Front yard, which is more of a working yard. This is where people come out to take a phone call or smoke or even have a chat. This is the existing structure of the original building that we left as a temporary works to prop the brick wall. This is flaring of the concrete that we'll talk about. against brick. And this is the kitchen, where it's a kind of big communal kitchen for him and his team to share lunches. They're quite lucky. They're a team of 6 in this huge building, so they've got loads of space. This is the only window that looks out to the outside world, really, across those warehouses that we talked about. Faces west, so when it gets really, in the evening, really hot, they draw the curtain. Looking the other way, there's this idea of transparency taking through. You see much more through than in this picture in reality. But there's kind of a series of glass screens that then give you glimpses of the courtyard. Again, so you're looking through that stair, back to that front room. It was very important for us to bring an element of warmth through the bits of the building that you touch. So we made a brass balustrade. Also, it gives a level of refinement to the building. It suggests that the building is finished, not that there's a kind of plastering team just about to turn up on site. And then there's also a little bridge here done in galvanized steel. This is a photo looking up from the ground floor up into a triple height space. So this little bridge, it's used for crossing from that door to that door. But it still allows all the light to filter down to the ground floor, which is what's happening here, that pool of light. This is a picture taken from the front door, looking through into the first yard. This is a really useful room. It's quite a big, long gallery, and it's used for all the props, for it's kind of goods in, goods out room for the building. It's really needed in a working building. This is the studio. So this is building 2. Building 2 has a double height space with a series of 2 single height spaces either side that form thresholds between the central space and the yards. Turning 90 degrees. And these rooms above form storage rooms for all of the props to go in when he needs to rearrange the room. The stairs in this room are also very important because they act structurally. We were adamant that the stairs had to be as thin as possible for the transparency across the building. And all the light comes through north-facing skylights. It's calculated so that at no point during the year there's direct light on a table surface. Because the original brief was to use tables for layouts. So again, building 3, kitchen, going up into a gym. Actually, this space gets used as a makeup room for all the shoots now. And then this is the kind of greenest of all of the yards at the back, with a fire escape coming down. And in the evening, the kind of west-facing facade gets this kind of warm glow. The lights become much warmer. The artificial lights are much warmer on purpose. They're pendant, so the light comes further down into the room and kind of creates a much more domestic, much pleasant atmosphere at night.
One of the real constraints was the site itself. Working on a site this narrow, the main practical access is from the road, sort of 60 meters away at some parts. So it's very important not to paint yourself into a corner. The buildings were built sort of from the back of the site outwards. Building 3 was finished from a structural point of view before you could start building 2, before you could start building 1. We also have a great number of different existing foundation conditions for this sort of piecemeal party wall / boundary wall. And along the other side, there's an existing basement under the 2008 development, which had its own sort of complications foundation-wise. The sort of variety of conditions means that you end up having 6 different external wall build-ups, which gave Carlos a real headache. This is sort of the culmination of a great deal of work to find out how everything would be insulated and waterproofed around the site boundaries. The other thing about a narrow site is that you have to be really quite tidy. I think they tried to be. You've got a limited amount of space to store all of the materials, everything you're going to turn into the finished building. This is Jim. He was in charge of constructing formwork, which meant that he was bringing a lot of that material on and off the site. There's a lot of craftsmanship in it. For certain bespoke details, they were bringing in and bending the rebar on site sort of traditional method of bending rebar, sort of getting some pegs and a bit of wood and measuring it out and doing it on site to shape. The quality of carpenters that we had on site was sort of really nice as well. So from a structural point of view, obviously we leveled the existing building. There's nothing particularly unusual about this site from a soil or geotechnics point of view. It's just London clay and the foundations are mass concrete poured into trenches. There was some slightly interesting things for me and for engineers about what went on with the existing basement next door and trying to avoid having to underpin the party wall, but I won't go into all of that. So here's structure of building 1. The ground floor slabs are just ground bearing reinforced concrete. The primary structure for the upper floors is they're reinforced concrete floors bearing onto load-bearing blockwork walls. And then the external walls are board-marked concretes. Now the really interesting thing about that is that obviously when you do an RC frame, you're building up the structural skeleton and then you're cladding it and fitting it out with partitions and all the rest of it. In this case, we're sort of doing everything inside out. Because you need to have a pristine finished blockwork load-bearing structure inside, you're having to cast all of your floor slabs on props before you build a block wall up to them. You're also not able to build those internal leaves of the cavity walls in blockwork until after you've cast your external wall in full and pulled your formwork out of the way. So it was a real sequencing challenge to get the result we needed, or the architect needed, perhaps I should say. This is building 2, which is really interesting because it's so open internally. There's nothing breaking up that ground floor apart from the stairs. All of the vertical load is transferred side to side across the width of each building. The roofs in general are very thin concrete slabs onto these extremely slender downstand beams. In some cases, the roof slab is just 75 mil thick, and those downstand beams at regular centres, which have a lot to do with light diffusion in the space, we'll talk about in a second. So building 3's sort of more of the same sort of elements, and this is building 2 in section, the main studio space. The first sort of structural element I want to talk through in a little bit more detail is the stairs in building 2. Like I said, there's nothing providing stability at that ground floor. There's nothing breaking up the space except for those very slender stairs. And this sort of explains quite neatly how they work. This is the temporary works on site before the stairs were cast, a couple of big diagonal push-pull props. Those, in the temporary case, are what stops the building from falling over sideways, or at least really badly damaging next door's building. And in the permanent case, all of that work is done by the 2 diagonal stairs. We're going to talk later about self-compacting concrete, which was used for almost all of the structure in all the buildings. The exception was these stairs, just because self-compacting concrete by its nature is very fluid. And if you try to pour it into a stair formwork, you can't trowel off a tread because it all comes flowing straight out of the bottom. If you try and put a top surface onto your formwork for the stairs, then you get a really, really poor tread finish. So those ended up being a standard mixed concrete. A lot of reinforcement packed into quite a small stair and very firmly tied in top and bottom. So we started off with protruding rebar left into the first floor slab, left protruding out of the first floor slab, just to say, and out of the ground. There's a mass concrete foundation just under this stair base. But you can't allow for everything that's going to happen on site. This was someone over enthusiastically driving a digger around, completely flattened the starter bars for our very important structural stair. Luckily, steel being a ductile material, you can just, once your engineer's gone and looked at it, you might be able to just bend it back up into shape and reuse it, and it will be fine, unless the architect decides they want to move the stair, which did happen. That was, yeah, I mean, we dealt with it. We understood the reasons why this was wanted, how it would improve the space, and we thought, okay, you can do a lot in concrete, It can become very complicated when you're trying to do an unexpected load transfer, but we came up with something workable, which you see here, which was good. Just a little thing, anytime you're working in concrete, you need to have a great deal of control on site. Like, it's always make sure your contractor is taking photo records or your engineer is visiting, just so that there's a way of making sure that the reinforcement has gone in correctly before it's set in stone, so to speak, particularly for key structural details like that one. So that's the finished stair. I went to a talk recently where someone defined elegance as something which is working harder than it appears to be. And I think through 6A pushing us to really to the limits, we've achieved something which looks very elegant in the finished building. We essentially start off just specifying a strength for concrete on most projects. On visual concrete projects, there's a huge amount that goes into that. You have your detailing of structural elements, everything about the formwork, release agents applied to a formwork, how you place and compact on site, how you allow it to cure, what the weather's doing, are all sort of important to what you'll end up in the finish. It's not just the engineer specifying a mix. But as far as the mix goes, we want a really high cement content and a low water cement ratio. Essentially meaning that there's lots of cementitious particles working for you in the mix, getting up against your well-prepared formwork and ending up with that excellent quality of finish that you want. I'm going to hand back to Carlos to talk a bit about sampling.
So this was one of the first samples that we did to try and convince the client that we could have exposed self-finished finishes. He was really worried about the building either being too dark or the color of the light changing through reflection of the material. So early on, before swapping to self-compacting concrete, we were doing samples including about 70% cement to 30% GGBS, which the 30% GGBS does two things. Well, it reduces the carbon footprint of the concrete, and it also makes the concrete actually a bit lighter, which works in both directions for us. So this is us showing the client the concrete mix against the white blockwork through color blockwork that we wanted to use, and he sort of bought into it, so we went ahead. The second type of concrete sample that we did was to try and find out what type of roughs on board we would use. We ended up going with this sample here, C. And the reason we used it is roughs on board with planed edges, so it sits really tight. It doesn't give you any of leaching, and it provides quite a strong grain to the concrete. This other sample we did at the point where we were considering using self-compacting here at the bottom in relation to standard concrete mix, to see if we could tell the color difference, to see if it was going to be obvious. In the meantime, we also tested how to do a concrete sill, which was the only element that we had to precast and then slide into the formwork, because if we had tried to cast this in situ, the top surface would have been full of air completely. It wouldn't have lasted. It would have been a terrible finish. So we cast it upside down with exactly the same concrete mix on site, because that's the difference. If it had been cast off-site, it would come in a different color. So what was evident for everyone, and for the contractors especially, by doing the sample, is that the self-compacting gave them a better finish. They would reduce the amount of workmanship and the risk of having to redo some of the pours by using self-compacting. It is true that it costs more, but there was a saving in labor through not having to vibrate it. So that was when the change to self-compacting happened. This is another sample, which was, we were testing rebating the top edge of the formwork. So any shrinkage in the concrete when it's drying happens inside the wall rather than on the edge of the wall. So the next cast is cast against a straight edge. So you get this really neat day joints. All of the internal concrete was cast against an MDO board, which is paper-faced phenolic board. That gives you a very matte finish. We were interested in eliminating as much light reflection out of a shiny surface. If we had cast that against metal or phenolic, it would have been much shinier. So it was important for us to achieve a matte finish. This is the board we went for in the end. It's Douglas Fir, plain side, rough face. But what we also did was to talk to quite a lot of Swiss architects to try and understand the variables. And what we found out is that the best finish is always the second cast out of any natural timber. So in here, what we're trying to do is replicate the first cast by painting the boards with a cement mix. So the cement mix closes some of the micro pores of the timber, and it gives you a better, crisper finish in the second pour. Here they're left to dry. This guy's brushing off any excess cement. Then the release agent is applied, and then they're installed in the formwork. Here they're already starting to set out an external window. We also paid a lot of attention to spacers, and also here this guy's just checking that nothing's been left inside the formwork, which you'll be surprised happens quite a lot. Here we're striking the concrete. On the right you can see really clearly this idea of giving the concrete a brick dimension. The other element that we want to talk about is the roof beams. So these beams that Will explained before, these 100 mil thick roof beams, about 700 deep. What it means is when you have such a thin beam, it means that you've got to, if you're casting in concrete, you've got to fill the rest with formwork. So we cast these massive coffers on the roof with little gaps around the side. We didn't want to see the edge of the plywood on an internal corner, so we made the contractor chamfer all of the formwork. He wasn't particularly happy, but it does work. These guys are going round just before the pour with a fishing rod with a magnet, trying to pick up all the bits of steel tie wire that drop down into the bottom of the beams, because otherwise you will see them on the underside of the beam. I think this guy's got a hoover as well. What was quite interesting in the project was that the electricians had to come in really early, really early. The team that was doing all the electrical installations were not used to doing that, so it took them a long time to get their head around it. And here they are just before a pour, frantically trying to set out all of their points. This is the studio space when that's been struck. So the beams really reflect all this light in a very beautiful way so that the light doesn't land on the tables, like I said before. It's looking the other way. And I think Will's going to talk about how difficult these were to build.
So, roof beams from a structural point of view, these were one of the elements that really sort of pushed us to the choice to use self-compacting concrete. 100 mil wide is about the most slender you can go in situ concrete. They're quite heavily reinforced because the span, they have a 25 mil bar in the bottom of each one. If you're trying to do this in regular mixed concrete, then you need to make sure that you can vibrate effectively to get a poker down the side of the reinforcement without dislodging any reinforcement or impacting on your inside face of formwork and spoiling the finish. You need to be able to make sure that your reinforcement is all properly tied together and won't get dislodged by the momentum of concrete itself pouring into the mould. And where it started to get really sort of over the top with these ones was, instead of a standard pre-welded reinforcement mesh for the roof slab, we were starting to have to think about laying loose bars for the roof just to make sure that there were voids for concrete and vibrating pokers to go in every time where there was a downstand roof beam.
We explored the color of the wood of the windows. That we actually stained Accoya to bring a really sort of warm brown to the timber windows, and used a lot of brass to give it an extra warmth. We did all the windows and shutterings and doors out of bespoke joinery. This is a prototype for a 2-story window that the joiner was actually very reluctant to make because he thought it would never work, but it did in the end, so it was great. We detailed absolutely everything, so we had to take all the responsibility because the joiner was not on board with it. So something we were very happy to do. This is during the installation, and this is in the inside. Will's spoken a little bit about the load-bearing external wall being white, no paint, so it's a completely white block. How do you not get it dirty when you're casting the concrete? You actually don't have it there. What we did is we propped the whole building in across. We made every external wall out of 2 layers of blockwork. The hidden layer was standard concrete, standard grey blockwork, the load-bearing capacity that we wanted. That helped set out the actual shape of the roof and held the perimeter. We started building the internal white leaf as the prop starting to come down. What it meant is that we had to draw every single block to make sure that all the tolerances were taken in places where we wanted them to be taken. But it was useful, if painful, but it was an interesting process. I wanted to talk about these sawtooth roof lights that I alluded on before. They're facing north, so we had a very large expanse of south-facing surface, very useful for PVs. Built out of very thin concrete, cast at an angle with a top shutter. Not much of an issue here if the finish on the top concrete is really bad because it's being hidden by the insulation, but quite a complex pour. By the time the contractor got to the roof, they were so used to self-compacting concrete that they were really happy to take this challenge on. So that was quite good. But it does produce quite beautiful formwork. This is the end result. Very happy contractor here. Next thing I want to talk about is this flaring of the concrete face, which is to do with this trying to hide the security measures of the building. The client was very wary of security because he has his archive, all his photographic archive there. So the concrete flares out to allow for a kind of tubular, kind of drum roller shutter to hide underneath it. It catches the light really beautifully when on an oblique. It does mean that the rebar is quite complex and the shuttering is quite tricky as well. And we are also pouring concrete against the top shutter and hoping that it's a good finish. So it's a combination. Here it worked because it's a combination of the rough sawn timber boards, which allow some of the air to soak into them. Enough head of pressure by continuing the pour, and the self-compacting itself. The last element I want to talk about is the yards and nature, which is kind of this kind of siting of the building. At times, the building site looked like a bomb site. There's a lot of broken concrete, a lot of spills. We had a lot of time to think about these yards, about the external spaces, and we really enjoyed this kind of mess. Thinking about a working building. So we worked with Dan Pearson here and worked on a mix of plants that was inspired on derelict sites, on sites that get self-seeded, and that need very little tending, that sort of grow where nature takes over. Trees are seen through the building at every point, so there's always the kind of nature in relationship to this concrete, which is really important. The mulch in all the yards is also broken concrete, so there's kind of self-seeding plants start taking over and growing through it. The trees had to be craned, which is quite a show. We had to close the road So these are the yards last summer, starting to be greener, much greener than the first ones that I showed you. So they get greener the further back you go. We thought a lot about the rainwater pipes and how these discharge into the yards. And they're really loved by the team there at the studio. They really enjoy. They're used for social events. They're used for working in. They're used for shoots. And what's quite interesting is that they're also used in ways that you can never imagine. That's it. Thanks.